Good afternoon, and welcome to this year's Charles K. Wilkinson Lecture Series. I'm Diana Craig Patch, the acting head of the Department of Egyptian Art, and I'm delighted to welcome you all here this afternoon to this year's set of lectures on the art of burial. I have been asked just to remind you, this will all be a good thing, that there's a 10-minute break after the second lecture, just so you know, and I don't forget to announce it. Charles Wilkinson, for those of you who are not familiar with him, and of course it's been a while, was first was part of the Met in 1920 when he joined the MMA excavations in Thebes as a graphic artist. There he copied many tomb paintings, of which these facsimiles hang out in our galleries, and I'm sure you've looked at them many times. In 1956, he was appointed curator of the Department of Ancient Near Eastern Art at the Metropolitan, and it merged with the Department of Islamic Art in 1959, so that he headed both of those areas. And so now you can see why the three choices of the lectures here, Ancient Egypt, Ancient Near East, and Islamic Art, belong to this series, because he was intimately involved in all three cultural areas. From 1970 to 1974, he was the Hagop Kevorkian Curator of Ancient Near East at the Brooklyn Museum, and he also taught as an adjunct professor of Islamic art at Columbia University. He was associated with the Met for 66 years, which is, I think, just an amazingly long period of time, and he died in 1986. His friends came together, and they're the ones that sponsored this series that we are able to have every year. And as Dorothea said in 2011 when she introduced the lecture that year, originally more than 100 friends contributed to the fund, and that's a real measure of the man, how many friends he had who were willing to do this. 1987 was the first lecture in the series, and I'm delighted to be able to welcome you this year. But before we begin the lectures, which I'm really looking forward to, I have a small surprise, and it's in conjunction with the art of burial, actually. Perneb, the Mastaba, which I'm sure many of you know quite well, which are at the front of the Egyptian galleries. As you come in, it's that big stone building, has been at the Metropolitan Museum for 100 years. So this year is its centennial, and I have two very talented members in my department who have put together a small video to celebrate Perneb's arrival at the Metropolitan. So I hope you enjoy this little bit of a break, and then we'll pick up with the lecture series. Could you run the video, please? Nice way to celebrate 100 years, I think, and almost actually to the month. So now I would like to very much introduce a good friend of mine. I've known Macy Roth for a very long time, and she is going to give the first lecture in the series, The Art of Burial. She grew up in Oregon, and she earned her BA and her PhD from the University of Chicago with a specialty in Egyptology, in particular the Old Kingdom, the time of the pyramids. Her dissertation was on an early system of patronage and labor organization, and that was published by the Oriental Institute, which is part of the University of Chicago. She's interested in a wide variety of other topics and has published extensively. She has held positions at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, the University of California at Berkeley, and Howard University. Right now, she's a clinical associate professor at New York University in Egyptology, and she is the director of the graduate study program in Ancient Near East and Egyptian Studies. She has done a great deal of field work, both epigraphic as well as archaeological, in non-royal tombs at Giza in particular, and she's published one book on that and is actually working up the second volume. But she has a very close tie to the Metropolitan because in 2009 and 2010, she was a J. Clausen Mills Fellow at the MMA, where she began her work on our Old Kingdom Mastaba chapels, of which we have 3. And today, she's going to talk to you about those chapels, and in particular, the daily life scenes that you see in them and why they are placed where they are. So I would like to welcome Macy Roth.
Thank you. I'd like to begin by expressing my gratitude to Dr. Patch and her staff, as well, of course, as her predecessor, Dr. Dorothea Arnold, not only for inviting me to talk to you today, but also for giving me the opportunity to study and publish these 3 Metropolitan Museum tomb chapels that I'll be talking about. Without the support and friendship of the department, I would have had much less to say today than I do. And I'd also like to thank the museum for the fellowship that I received in 2009-2010, which allowed me to focus on these tomb chapels and to develop some of the ideas that I'll be sharing with you. Yes. The Egyptian Old Kingdom, or the Pyramid Age, is the first great flowering of pharaonic culture. The principal evidence for this period comes from its extensive cemeteries, the pyramids of its kings, and the tombs of its elite. For every official of any standing wanted to have a beautiful burial in the cemetery of the Western Desert, as the standard mortuary formula puts it, and did his best to build and decorate the finest tomb that he could afford. The underground burial chambers of these tombs were usually undecorated since they were closed and inaccessible after the funeral, but the chapel remained open and was carefully decorated. Here, offerings could be made and to the deceased, and here, during the year, his family would have visited on all the festival days to celebrate with him. These chapels were decorated with ritual scenes, but also with so-called daily life scenes, perhaps in part to ensure that random visitors might enter them and make an offering. The scenes you see here, a man barbecuing a duck on a stick and a butcher sharpening his knife with a whetstone, are directly opposite the door of the chapel and might have drawn in casual tourists. Egyptologists often explain these scenes of daily life as simple magical aids that allowed the wealthy tomb owner to continue to enjoy the presence of the pleasures of his daily life after his death. But the truth is, we really have no information at all telling us why these officials chose to decorate these tombs as they did. To work out what they were thinking, all we can really do is look for patterns in their choices and then try and determine why those patterns and choices would have worked for them. To give you an idea of how this is done, I'd like to begin today by showing you some general patterns that are found in Old Kingdom chapels and explain what I think they mean. Then we'll look much more closely at one of the Metropolitan Museum chapels, and I'll show you the patterns and anomalies that I found there and try and explain them when they aren't totally inexplicable, as of course the most intriguing ones always are. Let's begin, however, with a very brief history of the decoration of Egyptian tombs to give you an idea of some of the elements that you'll see in their later forms and the resonances that they would have had for visitors to those later chapels. The first monumental tombs we have of Egyptian officials are niched brick mud mastabas, mud structures called mastabas, which covered a central underground burial chamber and numerous storage chambers surrounding it. The only decoration was the niched facade that you see reconstructed here in this drawing, which is also called a palace facade. This facade was probably inspired by Mesopotamian architecture because it didn't really work very well for an Egyptian tomb. There's no point of focus for the funerary ritual. And so very early on, we begin to see attempts to make one niche more important than the others. The niched facades were plastered and covered with painted decoration, transforming the mastaba exterior into an imitation of a very different kind of architecture, made of brightly woven colored mats lashed to a wooden framework. Over the course of the first 3 dynasties, these facades became simpler and less extensive. They were often used only on the most visible sides of the mastaba, the east, with one of the niches increasingly, as I've said, being singled out as the main cult place, while the others slowly vanished and into a smooth facade. Thus we get in the late, that's interesting. Thus we begin to get, that should have been light gray, that square with the 2 pink notches. I don't know whether it looks as black to you as it does to me. Thus we begin to get in the late 3rd dynasty the 2 niched mastaba, in which the southern niche was dedicated to the tomb owner and was often aligned with its burial shaft and burial chamber. The northern niche, the little one, there, the little red square, was most often dedicated to the tomb owner's wife or to his parents, or occasionally, in a fit of egotism, to himself again. This mastaba superstructure in the 4th dynasty began to be built of stone masonry rather than brick and had sloping or battered sides, as you see in the reconstruction drawing. Notice, by the way, the right pointing north arrow on the mastaba superstructure there. It's conventional in Old Kingdom cemetery archaeology to put west at the top, because cemeteries were on the edge of the western desert, and the approach was generally from the east. But more importantly, the west was the realm of the dead, and the main focus of the architecture of the tomb was on the west. In the few images I'll be showing you where north is in the top, I will make a point of stressing this unconventional orientation. Some early stone mastabas were decorated only with carved and painted slab stelas, normally showing the offering table scene, in which the tomb owner is shown reaching out to a table of offerings, which usually consists mainly of half loaves of bread. You can see a whole loaf just under the tabletop there next to the red and black beer jar. The finest examples of these slab stelas, including this one, belonged to members of the royal family. More often, however, the offering table scene was incorporated into a so-called false door, the last remnant of the old niched facade, with a cylinder or drum above this deepest central niche to represent a rolled-up mat, again imitating this different kind of architecture. This rolled-up mat represented an open door for the spirit. Above that is the table scene, which is the same as the one on the slab stelas. The false door was covered with the name and titles of the deceased, and in this case, his wife, as well as offering formulas granting them the standard 1,000 loaves of bread, 1,000 jugs of beer, 1,000 bulls, 1,000 ducks, and so forth. The false door was the focal point of the Old Kingdom tomb chapel. It was clearly where the offerings to the dead were made and rituals were spoken. Through it, the spirit of the dead tomb owner could magically partake of his offerings and benefit from the rituals that were done for him. And this 2-niched mastaba type continued actually until the end of the Old Kingdom. But wealthier officials, as will often happen, felt they needed a little more scope. For them, the main southern false door was often moved inside the body of the mastaba to create a chapel sheltered from the sun and wind, and also to create more wall space for their names and titles, as well as for more extensive decoration, probably expensive as well. It is in this kind of chapel, the cruciform chapel, that in the early 4th dynasty we begin to get the first depictions of family, of ritual, and of scenes of daily life. In the 5th dynasty, the L-shaped chapel, yet another type, began to be built. In essence, both false door niches were then moved inside the chapel, and the chapel itself had the same shape as the mastaba, which I'm really hoping you can see from that angle. Entered opposite the northern niche, if there was one, the chapel extended south with its major niche at the south end of the west wall. The principal false door was aligned not only with the burial chamber and shaft of the tomb, but also often with the serdab, which was a sealed chamber holding statues of the tomb owner and his family. Through a small opening in or near the false door, these statues also benefited from the rituals and offerings done in front of the false door. Because there are so many L-shaped chapels, we can begin to see general patterns in the way that the decoration is arranged in them. Here are the most common locations for certain types of scenes in an L-shaped chapel, although I should stress that every chapel departs from this pattern in one way or another, not only in the placement of scenes, but also in the architecture, as you'll see. For example, scenes showing the tomb owner fishing and fowling in the marshes were very often placed at the facade of the chapel, even though they might also be placed with the marsh scenes on the north wall. The fishing and fowling scenes were symmetrical scenes, there we go, closely modeled on scenes found in royal temples. They show the tomb owner in a papyrus marsh, controlling chaotic forces of fish and birds that are rampant and uncontrolled in the marshes. On the left, he spears fish, and you notice the water turns up to make a little mound so that he needn't compromise his dignity by bending over. And on the right, he hunts birds with a boomerang throw stick, which is missing in this particular example. These scenes protected the chapel from such disorder and disruption since they show the tomb owner controlling it. They were more meaningful, of course, in the source scenes from the royal context where they had all sorts of cosmic implications. But in the non-royal context, they also probably had a punning sexual meaning. The word seti, to spear, also means to ejaculate. And the word kema, throw stick, meant to create or to bring into life, bring to being. And such scenes may therefore have magically reinforced the tomb owner's fertility, his sexual fertility, because in order to be reborn into the afterlife, he needed first to be reconceived. He needed, in fact, apparently, to reconceive himself. So fertility is an important subtext in many of the scenes we'll be looking at. So these scenes offered both protection and fertility, and this sort of duality of meanings and functions is not at all unusual in the tomb decoration I'll be talking about. As one would expect, the scenes on the west wall were mostly consisting of rituals and offerings and the sort of thing that you would have near the funerary focus. But other scenes could be placed here as well, perhaps to engage passersby and lure them into the tomb to make offerings. Here, for example, you see the west wall of the chapel of Nicauhor and his wife, whose name was Sekhem Hathor. This is one of the Metropolitan Museum chapels, and you can see it in Gallery 103, and I've put in a black and white photograph, so you'll have to go look at it because it's much more lovely than this. Because of its importance, the west wall of the tomb was very often made of more durable and higher quality materials than the other parts of the tomb. For example, in this chapel, one of the three brought over from Saqqara, this west wall was built of limestone and was carved with raised and painted relief. The other walls of the chapel were built only of mud brick, and they were plastered, and the scenes were painted on flat plaster, not on carved raised relief. The excavators felt that if they tried to move these thin layers of plaster to New York, they would not survive, so they left them in Egypt. The chapel had a central entrance, so it's not quite L-shaped. It had two false doors of almost equal size. Nicauhor's is to the south, and his wife Sekhem Hathor's is to the north. He is prominently displayed on both of them, but she does sit alone on her offering table scene, which is now detached, and I've made it a little bit larger out of feminist solidarity here, because otherwise she doesn't show up very much even on her own mortuary monument. Excuse me. Between the false doors, the lowest registers show appropriate ritual scenes, butchering of cattle, and above them offering bearers, which, if you can see, march toward the husband's false door. Surprise, not hers. So the third register from the bottom, however, shows wonderful scenes of musicians and people playing board games. This kind of entertainment is normally associated with the so-called banquet scene, although it doesn't always involve food, which is typically found on the southern wall. But in this tomb, of course, the southern wall was made of a lower quality of materials and only painted, and Nicauhor presumably moved this dramatic large-scale scene to where it would be more visible and enduring, right opposite the front door of the chapel. On the north and the east walls of the L-shaped chapel, we most often get attractive little vignettes of daily life, ordinary people going about their everyday tasks. These walls have often got geographical reference. For example, the marshes of the Delta in the north of Egypt are in the north of Egypt, which is probably why they were shown on the north wall. The east wall often shows work in the fields of the Nile Valley, which are to the east of the cemetery, which, remember, is in the west, on the western desert. These geographical references may have been an attempt to recreate the outside world, making the tomb into a kind of model of the world, model of the cosmos, as was done in later temples and tombs, clearly in Egyptian tradition. But I think perhaps at this early period, it's more likely that these references were simply to situate the tomb owner and situate the tomb and situate the visitors in the surrounding environment and to give directional guidance in interpreting the scenes. There are lots of little geographical allusions in these scenes where the thing in the scene is going the same direction as it would be in the outside world. The kind of scenes shown on the north and east chapel walls are very well illustrated in a little chapel from Giza, the Chapel of Nimatre, which I published several years ago. On the left of this somewhat truncated drawing, I've cut the edges off so that you can see more of it, to make it fit on the slide. The tomb owner is shown spearing fish in the papyrus marsh. You can see his foot there and his little son standing in front of him, and I think you can also see the way the water churns up so that it's directly in front of him and he doesn't have to bend. In the central part of the wall, we have men fishing beneath tall papyrus plants, and on the right, scenes of cattle raising, which is a major delta industry. That was where most of the cattle came from. I do not pretend to understand the little scene of spanking in the middle of this, but they often occur in cattle scenes. I don't know why. These scenes may be connected with fertility, because the marshes are a site of fertility, or they may be supplying cattle, the highest status food offerings to the cult magically, or they may have both functions. In any case, the placement of these scenes clearly alludes to the Delta region north of the cemetery. On the east wall, and here again I'm just showing the left half so it's large enough for you to see the range of animals and activities here. On the east wall, we have at the bottom a register of desert animals, very badly broken, but I think you can maybe make out the fact that all of them are mating. This theme, too, comes from royal temples and obviously has fertility implications. Above that lowest register, there are two registers of dogs and hunters attacking these animals, although there is one brave pair toward the center that is still mating. There is also a row of that, above that of birds, and to the right cattle, and then the wall becomes very badly worn indeed, but the next highest register seems to show men cutting grain and tying it into bales, and then after that, on the right, there are people who seem to be winnowing the grain with pitchforks, whereas to the left, we have the stereotypical fighting boatman scene, men in small boats attacking each other with their punting poles, which I think was a joke. I think the Egyptians found this amusing. If you look at the entire wall, you can see that all of this activity, here you are, is taking place under the watchful eyes of the tomb owner, whose lower body is visible at the right. The activity in the upper registers and the ones that we've lost above those may have been located in the Nile Valley to the east of the tomb. But the desert scenes, in fact, take place to the west of the tomb. And so this doesn't work as a direct reflection of the outside world as the northern wall does. Instead, it seems to work as a kind of map of the Nile Valley from east to west, top to bottom. Top is east, bottom is west. And the little "you are there" marker that you like to see on maps, it's a kind of map, actually runs directly under the tomb owner's feet, which is exactly where the tomb is, where the tomb owner is in his burial shaft, and also where his visitor is, situating all of these things between the agricultural land of the Nile Valley and the desert to the west. Now, southern walls, as I've said, are often decorated with banquet scenes. In the same chapel, Nicauhor sits in a comfortable armchair, a fly whisk over his shoulder, his loyal dog beneath his chair. There's no food here, but he's clearly enjoying himself, listening to music, playing a board game, and dictating to his scribes. This scene probably shows the tomb owner at home. Initially, I thought the positioning on the south wall, although as we've seen it can also be on the west, might reflect the position of Nicauhor's actual house, because presumably he lived at Memphis, which was to the south of Giza. But I think I've come up with a better explanation. We don't have a lot of evidence for domestic architecture, elite domestic architecture in this period. This is one of the best pieces. It's one of a row of identical houses of mortuary priests that was found at Giza. And here you can see it in a plan with north at the top, as settlement archaeology tends to put things. But you'll see why I'm interested when we turn the house to the standard of cemetery organization and put it to the right. I'd like to draw your attention to room G. Room G was convincingly reconstructed by Felix Arnold some years ago as a reception room, and you see his reconstruction drawing above. The owner of the house, the master of the house, sat in a small recess, it looks like a little closet, in the very southern end of this long, narrow room to receive his guests. The vaulted ceiling opened at both ends, admitting the northern breezes from the north to keep the master of the house comfortable, and admitting light from the south to illuminate the guests coming in so he would know who they were. What seems to have been overlooked in the study of these houses is that this room in particular appears in almost all of the elite architecture that we get from the Old Kingdom, and it is almost always oriented in the same direction. Overwhelmingly, you enter from the north and you move down to this little closet area in the south of the room. Such rooms also occur in the underground chambers of tombs during the first three dynasties, where it was customary to use underground architecture that imitated houses and domestic places. This is actually the substructure of the step pyramid, the royal pyramid at Saqqara, and north is again at the top, which tells you that room 12, which is my little reception room, has actually been turned 90 degrees. So rather than entering from the south, or entering from the north, you would be entering from the east, as in fact you would into a mortuary cult, where the eastern part of the eastern valley is where people are coming in to make offerings and so forth. This way the king can sit at the west, and you can see his burial chamber is actually directly on line with this and just behind it to welcome visitors coming from the east. And if you look at the east, you will see that there are three niches directly to the east of this room, and the central one, again, is aligned with this reception room. So it was an important room, and you can also tell it was an important room because it was one of only a very few rooms that are tiled in blue tiles. It's called a blue chamber on this. And you can see here what this looked like. These blue chambers are called this because they were lined with blue faience tiles that adorn their walls in imitation of matting. Again, this theme of imitating matting in these structures. And here you can see a reconstructed panel of one of these walls at the Cairo Museum. Now, if we go back to Nimatre's scene, banquet scene, I think you can see that directly behind him is a large mat hanging on the wall. You can see the hem down by its feet, or the border, the southern border of the mat. And I would argue that where he is actually sitting is in a reception room in his house, in one of these niches, like we've seen. There are similar chapels, or similar depictions on the southern wall of the tomb chapel of E.E. Mary, for example. And here you can see the pattern of the mat in the background and the ties that attach the mat to the wall, as well as the wooden columns which support the ceiling of that long room in front of him. And better still, here you can see the colored mat with the ties and so forth from the tomb of Seshennefer III, another Giza tomb near Berlin. So I would argue that in Old Kingdom culture, high-ranking men sat at the south end of long, formal rooms to greet their visitors in their house. And I think this makes it quite clear why these scenes tend to decorate the southern wall of the tomb chapel. And also they may suggest why the southern false door is the principal one, and why you enter a lot of burial chambers, even royal burial chambers, from the north. This is the direction that visitors come. So the western scenes of an L-shaped chapel focus on the funerary ritual. The northern and eastern scenes give the chapel a geographical, if not a cosmological context, and the southern wall depicts the tomb owner at home, ready to receive his guests. Now, while the development of L-shaped chapels was generally, once they were fully developed, was generally well adapted to the purpose of Egyptian tomb chapels and was used for many decades, toward the end of the Fifth Dynasty, a new chapel form was introduced, again from the royal realm. Essentially, the false door on the southern end of the L-shaped chapel was pushed back into the body of the mastaba to make a long, narrow room. This displaced the serdab, which moved to one side or another, and the long space that resulted is called an east-west offering chapel. It also created additional space for decoration. But unlike the decorative template for the L-shaped chapel, which I hope I have stressed is usually only partially observed and there are lots of variants, the decoration of the east-west chapel was absolutely rigidly consistent, perhaps because of its royal origins. The west wall was entirely taken up by the false door. Adjacent to it are two mirror image offering table scenes with the tomb owner seated at his table of bread, and then a compartmental offering list, a kind of menu above. Processing west towards these figures along both of the long walls were several registers of offering bearers with ritualists at the head of each file. The eastern wall was decorated with registers of butchers at work, and above both the butchers and the processions of offering bearers, there were piles of offerings. It's absolutely standard. And the tomb whose centennial we are celebrating today at the museum has an east-west offering chamber as its main room. The L-shaped chapel, part of the old L-shaped chapel, has here been reduced to a small vestibule, and the main part of the chapel is the east-west offering chapel. The Serdab statue, as you can see in this little model, has been moved to the south, and I think you know how I would explain that. So here you see the placement of decoration is absolutely normal in the chapel of Perneb. His name, I'm told, should actually be read, well, I agree, should actually be read Pereni Nebi, but everybody calls him Perneb, and I'm not going to be any different, so I will call him Perneb today for traditional reasons. The chapel has beautiful carvings, and the paint is quite well preserved, and there are many interesting details, but it has very few daily life scenes. The scenes are limited to those that would earlier have occurred on the false door itself, because it becomes a sort of extension of the false door into the tombs. I hope you can see here there are colored blocks stacked up along both sides of the false door. This is a kind of border, and they are visible at other borders and other corners throughout the tomb. I'll explain them in just a moment. Flanking the false door we have these apparently identical offering table scenes. I've called them mirrored, but they're of course not exactly identical. Most obviously, the arm positions are different. That's because then, as now, Middle Eastern men eat only with their right hands. Other differences are a little harder to explain. For example, the chair to the left of the false door has legs like lion paws, and the chair to the right of the false door has legs like bulls. What does this mean? I have no idea. Like the figures of Perneb, the files of offering bearers and ritualists seem to be identical on both walls. In fact, they're even labeled with the same names. So the people doing the rituals where their names are mentioned, the names are the same on both walls. That suggests that the procession is a single procession going up the middle, which actually places the visitor to the tomb in the middle of the procession. In an unusual detail here, interestingly, the ritualists that lead both the lowest, you can only see part of him, and the second file are actually shown with their backs to us. You can see their front shoulder, the line of their front shoulder cuts through the arm that is reaching out. And this is presumably so that the lowest one can wring the goose's neck and the next one can lift the lid of the incense burner with their right hands as they should. Their counterpart selves on the opposite wall are shown facing the viewer. So again, this mirroring is something that they're trying to emphasize. On the east wall, as is conventional, we have men leading bulls and oryxes on the bottom registers in to be slaughtered, and then the upper register shows butchers. No surprises here. Piled to the ceiling above the offering bearers and the butchers are several registers of stacked food offerings. Because Perneb's chapel is so well preserved, we can even see the pattern of black ties. Can you see at the very top of the slide, little 3 ties coming down and attaching to the scenes? These refer to the same fiction I've been talking about, dating back to that painted matting in the First Dynasty, that these wall scenes are not actually carved into the walls, but they are woven mats or tapestries attached to the ceiling by these ties. And the borders of colored blocks that I pointed out on earlier slides represent the woven ends of these tapestries, the selvages, so to speak. Of the 3 Metropolitan Museum chapels found just north of the Step Pyramid complex, which you see here, I have already described the west wall of Nicauhor and Sekhem Hathor's chapel, and talked a little bit more extensively about the chapel of Perneb. But I'd like to spend the rest of my talk discussing the 3rd chapel in the area, found just west of Perneb's Mastaba and labeled number 80 here, sideways, but I'm sure you can read it. This chapel is an L-shaped chapel with only one false door. It doesn't have a northern false door. It's quite tiny, only 4.5 feet across, and it's actually been exploded a little so that people can walk into it in the museum. You'll see there are gaps at the corners to make it a little bit larger. The notch you see cut in the northern wall, making it not a conventional L-shaped chapel, is actually not important at all. It may be. It's a little notch for storage, a little recessed storage area, and doesn't go all the way up the wall. The tomb had 2 owners, Nefer-Eretz and Prince Raam Kai, but they didn't share the tomb like Nicauhor and Sekhem Hathor did, the couple whose west wall we talked about previously, but instead they owned it sequentially. Nefer-Eretz was responsible for the wall decoration, which I would now argue was done in the early 5th dynasty, not later, but he never used the tomb, or if he did, he was ousted from it, because in the later 5th dynasty, his name was erased throughout the tomb, and the false door was reinscribed for a king's son, Raam Kai. On this close-up from the false door, I think you can see that the original name has been erased and it's been recarved rather crudely. This afternoon, I'm going to mainly be talking about the original chapel decoration that is commissioned by Nefer-Eretz, and with one exception, not mentioning Raam Kai's changes. The facade of the chapel wasn't decorated, but the walls of the entrance passage were. I've marked one of them in turquoise on the section here, which cuts through, section CD cuts through the passage. They're lovely reliefs, but I'm going to skip them in the interests of time and begin with the northern wall, just to the left. From there, we'll be moving further left around the chapel walls or counterclockwise to the west, south, and finally to the east. On the north wall, only the upper part is decorated because of the storage chamber below, which you now see in two different views. A fallen block found directly in front of this wall probably came from the upper level, and you can see it's been restored there, sort of floating above the scenes that are actually on the wall. In the uppermost preserved register, or partly preserved register, we have scenes of cattle raising. They are mating at the right. Trust me, you can actually see the right number of legs. They're mating. And then there is a calf being born to the left. These are appropriate northern march scenes, appropriately northern, and as we've talked about, cattle raising is very big in the Delta, and also appropriate on the next register down to the left, you see the gutting of fish, which is again a marshy sort of activity. Two men are carrying a basket of fish towards the guy who is gutting them, and you would expect to see a fishing scene behind him, but you don't. What you see is a bread-making scene, and there are bread-making scenes below that, as well as scenes of straining beer. These are obviously essential elements of Egyptian life, and this sorts of activities would be done all over the country, but not exclusively in the north, obviously. On the left of the lower register are more offering bearers, and this is a bit of a problem because they are turning away from the west wall, they are turning away from the false door, they are not marching toward any image that we have of the tomb owner, which is a little unusual. So when we get one of these reversals in orientation, we try and come up with an explanation for it. And the explanation for this becomes clear when you notice that the way that this wall is very carefully divided in two. See, all of these scenes break exactly at the same point. And then when you look at a plan of the mastaba, you notice, I hope you can see on the plan, that they have reconstructed in the right corner as you enter a wooden door that would have closed over the doorway. And I think this wooden door probably ends just at the line, the dashed line that I have marked here, because it covers up half of the scenes. And I'm suggesting that perhaps on the door itself was a picture. Since they had no facade decoration, they had a painting of the tomb owner on the door, so when they opened it up, he would be covering the bread-making scenes, and these offering bearers would be marching towards him. Otherwise, I cannot come up with any other reason why the offering bearers would be marching in this strange direction. Sorry, that's the direction they're marching. These offering bearers, you can see they're beautifully carved. This is a gorgeous tomb. These offering bearers are also strange because, as you can see in the middle of the row, there is a man who is carrying an emptied platter. Now, normally, processions in Egyptian tombs are either food processions or they are furniture processions. You don't get them mixed together. And this is pretty clearly with the ducks and the bread and so forth. This is a food procession. So why is he carrying an empty platter? If you look at it carefully, you can see it's sort of bumpy on top of the platter. That's probably because there was originally food carved on the platter, but it's been almost entirely erased. And what's more, there is another example in the tomb. This is on the left of the false door on the west wall, where another man is carrying what was originally pretty clearly a platter loaded with food. Here you can see the shadows of the triangular loaves that were stacked on this, and they have been erased. So they've erased the food on these platters. It's hard to tell whether maybe Raim Kai, when he usurped the tomb, he was a prince, maybe the food was not appropriate towards him, or he didn't like asparagus or something like that. Or he may have felt that this particular position, which occurs only with these two erased guys, with the food carried tucked under the chin, was somehow unhygienic. It's really hard to imagine why they would erase the food on the platter. The second man with the empty tray is, as you can see at the left end and above, much higher than the other guy on the western wall. I don't know whether the position's important or not. It's just one of many unexplained details in this chapel. Moving on to the west wall, I think you can see that over half of it is taken up by the false door. The false door is quite conventional, except for the erasures and recarvings, which I'm not going to go into here. So I'm going to focus mostly on the scenes on the northern end of the wall, which are much more interesting anyway, and here you can see them. The top register shows the very base of an offering table scene, appropriately right next to the false door, with the tomb owner facing away from the false door. And beneath it, we have a row of food and 2 rows of offering bearers carrying large platters piled with huge quantities of food. At the end of the top of those registers, there are 2 guys that may refer to the scenes on the north wall. There may be a sort of allusion to the scenes on the north wall or a continuation of them, since they show guys carrying 2 jars of beers to their shoulders and a bread mold with bread in it. Bread and beer, as I've said, is the essential element. The 1,000 loaves of bread, 1,000 jugs of beer are the essential first 2 elements of the Old Kingdom offering ritual. The 3rd and the 4th elements are poultry, ducks that is, and cattle, and you see those 2 being provided on the 2 lower registers. The lowest register shows men pulling a clap net. They are 5 men are pulling on the rope and to close the net, and there's a man in front of them who's waving a cloth over his head to signal for them to pull, and that's what will close the net and capture all those birds that you see on the picture there. Finally, at the end of the register to the left end, right next to the false door, you can see a man carrying 3 ducks freshly caught to offer to the tomb owner. But this actually isn't the end of this scene, which is a marsh scene somewhat related to the north wall here. But if you look up, skipping the cattle register, you can see that at the end of the 3rd register, there is this man roasting a duck on a stick with 2 ducks above it. Now, I've mentioned that the guy at the bottom has 3 ducks he's offering at the false door. The guy who's roasting the ducks has 3 ducks. And if you look, the distribution of the ducks on the offering tables above there are exactly 3. I cannot help asking myself if they are the same 3 ducks in 3 different stages of life, so to speak. They form sort of the point of an arrow moving up towards the tomb owner. These rather boring trays of offerings are sort of interesting if you look at them carefully. For example, the trays with ducks on them almost always have leeks. So I'm wondering if that was a particularly popular combination in Egyptian cuisine. I think these do bear a little more looking at. Also, if you look at the way these trays are made up, you can see that almost all of them are built on big, nice triangular bread loaves, which I've colored in yellow where they occur on the wall. But there are 2 that don't. One of them is the central one on the lowest level of offering bearers, and then directly in front of the tomb owner himself is a table that is not built on this triangular loaf. In both cases, they are built on pots of stew, which you can also see directly below. And if you color the meat in this scene, you can see that the stew pot seems to sort of float up. We have it first over the cooking stove in the 2nd register, and then you have the pot of stew in the middle register, and then with 2 registers gap, you get it directly in front of the tomb owner. I don't quite know what this means, but I think it is it can't be random, the placement of these stew pots moving up the wall. So I think it does have some sort of meaning. And interestingly, these 2 movements of beef and poultry are also marked by a difference in orientation. If you look at the wall, everybody is moving or looking or pulling, in the case of the clapnet guys, towards the false door. And the guy carrying the meat to the stew pot and the guy roasting the duck are the only 2 that face the other direction. This adds visual variety, but I think it may also be meant to mark something that you should notice. And we know that these offerings are not totally random. For example, almost all of these platters carry lettuce, which was thought by the Egyptians to be an aphrodisiac. And we know that it's important, as I mentioned to you before, that the tomb owner be fertile, be sexually virile, because he had to re-engender himself. He had to reconceive himself to be reborn in the afterlife. But the lead platter, the one that's just at the top of this, does not have lettuce on it. Instead, it has a much more potent symbol of rebirth and regeneration, the papyrus, a bundle of papyrus plants, which are associated with the marsh and all of its fertility. Now, before we leave this wall, one further strange detail. If you look at the bottom register again, this clap net scene, you can see that these guys who are pulling the rope and the guy who's making the signal with the cloth, they're all naked. This is not usual. It might be argued that they are naked because, of course, it's next to a lake and they might fall in, or they might otherwise get splashed or wet, so they didn't want to wear their clothes. But in fact, this is a very common type of scene, and in all the other examples I've been able to find, the men wear either kilts or loincloths. I will return to this weird nudity later. But at the moment, we move on to the south wall, moving past the false door. Now, the south wall of the chapel, I wanted to be a banquet scene, of course, so I could hang my theory about reception rooms on it, but it was not to be. Instead, this south wall shows something very different. It shows two different kinds of terrain, the river and the desert, which we haven't seen yet in this tombs. Both the river and the desert are sort of liminal areas. They're outside the cultivated land, which was where the Egyptians actually lived. Above them is a standard compartmental offering list, which is actually probably associated with the false door to the right of it. Each of these two lower scenes, some of the nicest in the tombs, occupy two registers. The boats that you can see have no sails, which would normally indicate to us that they're moving northward, but in fact the captions tell us that they're moving westward. Which is standard, and in fact they're moving westward in the chapel itself, since they're on the south wall, moving right. The upper two registers show the hunt in the desert, a smaller version of the kind we saw in my little Giza tomb. The dogs chase the ibexes and gazelles, the hunter lassos them so that they can be brought to the tomb and sacrificed as offerings. Disparate as these scenes are, there's an odd little tie between them. One of the boats has a hedgehog prow, making it into a kind of representation of a hedgehog itself. And the two registers above, an actual hedgehog is shown, peering out at the hunt. It's difficult to determine whether this is significant or it's simply a matter of the artist putting it in as some sort of joke. I have established after several eye-opening minutes, of research on YouTube that hedgehogs do not mate face-to-face. So for once, this is probably not about fertility. There are two other odd things about the third register. For one thing, the right part of it is the only place in the entire tomb that does not face the false door, which is to the right. Animals, boats, peoples, hieroglyphs, everything else is right-facing on this wall, but except for the man and the hedgehog at its left edge, everything in the third register faces left. And I think the reason for this is, besides, again, adding visual interest, is probably that the ground line of this register, the border between the desert and the river, continues around the corner to the left, where a large figure of the tomb owner stands. As with the map I showed you in my little Giza tomb, this baseline serves to establish where the tomb owner, Nimatre, is and where his tomb is. So this wall doesn't work exactly as a geographically oriented map like the one in Nimatre's tomb, but I think it does locate the tomb owner. And I think perhaps because the gap is wider, it's not between the desert and the cultivation, but between the desert and the river, it may actually locate the Nefer Irid and Esfur's around the corner, not in his tomb, but in some sense still in the realm of the living. He's shown with his two sons there. Another odd thing about this wall is that, once again, people who ought to be wearing clothes are not wearing clothes. And this time they really ought to be wearing clothes because there's no water nearby, and in fact, going naked into the desert would be nuts. But they are both clearly naked. I've spent an embarrassing amount of time staring at the one on the left, and he is indeed naked. I don't really know what this is, sorry. But the fact that both of these guys, all of these guys, are dealing with ropes and pulling ropes towards a false door could be significant. This is something I'm still working on. Okay, finally, the east wall, which initially seems to be a complete riot of unrelated scenes, but in fact it has a clear structure. In the lowest register, we see the cultivation of grain. And although people are facing all sorts of directions, the orientation of time is this way. We have people cutting grain, loading it on donkeys, trampling it with donkeys to loosen the chaff, and then throwing it up in the air to clean out the chaff with the wind. Whether this register is meant to continue on around the corner to the north wall, where we have the beginning of the grinding of the grain and the making of bread, I would suspect it does, and that may be the reason for this orientation. Above it, we have a row of personified farms, the farms that are set up for the support of the funerary estate of Nefer-Irid-Enes are marching as ladies, because the word for farm is feminine, towards his false door. And above that, we have 3 registers of animals being brought to Nefer-Irid-Enes, and the ducks I can't do anything with, the birds, but the oryxes that you see in the middle register, that's the same level as the top register of wild animals that we see on the south wall, and the cattle that you see above it is the same register as the cattle breeding scenes that we saw on the north wall. So this may be tying the tomb together. They're all marching towards Nefer-Irid-Enes, but if you look at the upper register where we have dancers, they are not marching towards Nefer-Irid-Enes. And these music and clapping scenes like we see at the top are the sort of things one would expect to find in a banquet scene again. I would restore, in fact, this wall, the upper part of this wall is a banquet with another register above the dancers, perhaps of food, musicians, scribes, family members, and the tomb owner, and perhaps his wife, seated facing them directly over the chapel entrance. This register, which you see here as the blue arrow, is on the same level as the figure of the tomb owner seated at a pot of stew on the west wall. And I would say that these 2 figures, somewhat facing each other, would probably be at the same scale. I think the reversal of the banquet scene may just be for, again, variety, because otherwise he would be directly over the standing figure of himself on the south end of the wall. But I think also it may be to contrast this scene, which shows him, I would argue, in his life, and the opposite scene, which shows him at a funerary banquet after death. So we have an east-west contrast between life and death. Okay, just to finish up, not only the east wall is divided into these 3 scenes. If you continue these 3 dotted lines on the west wall, you can see, again, they divide into 3 zones, the same 3 zones. And on the north and the south wall, we also have 3 zones, the boats on the lower part, and then the hunt. The offering list does go down into the middle zone, but never mind. And then above, we have the piled offerings, I think, to go with the piled offerings that we just saw on the west wall. And if you look at all of these, you can see that they have actually set up a hierarchy of people connected with their relationship to the tomb owner. The upper part is domestic, the middle part is people who served him directly, and the lower part is hired professionals and support staff. So there are 3, I would argue, different kinds of people shown in these scenes, and there are also geographical references and interconnections between these scenes, both the vertical ones and somewhat angled ones. And many of these relationships, these interlocking layers of meaning and multiple functions are very difficult to discover, but I hope I've been able to show you today some of the complexity and sophistication of the ideas behind the art of an Egyptian burial. Thank you for your attention.